Can Minnesota claim a central role in a now forbidden musical genre that links two U.S. presidents, a dancing bear, a forgotten opera, a legendary basketball team, an outlawed ritual, and America's favorite rock venue? You bet we can, although this particular rabbit hole is an uncomfortable one. Do you remember the bear from the Hamm's beer commercials? The Hamm's Bear is one of Minnesota's most beloved commercial art mascots. Advertising Age magazine named the Hamm's Bear and Jingle one of the best ad campaigns in the last century. Do you remember that jingle? The tom-tom drums, the unison singing, the imagery, the melody. To a 21st century ear, it's positively dripping with what we now understand as cultural appropriation, when a dominant culture takes elements from another culture and uses them out of context. However, the whole story goes back much further in time, is far more complex than it first appears, and has surprising Minnesota ties. Buckle up. 1867. Frances Densmore is born in Red Wing, Minnesota. As a child, she develops a passion for Native American music from listening to an encampment of Dakota people just across the river. She writes, "We could hear the throb of the drum when they were dancing, and sometimes we could see the flickering light of their campfire. I fell asleep night after night to the throb of the Indian drum." 1872. Arthur Farwell is born in St. Paul, Minnesota. Eventually, Farwell travels the world, studying engineering at MIT and music composition in Berlin and Paris. 1882. Alberto Bimboni is born in Florence, Italy. Since the 1700s, the prominent Bimboni family have been important musical inventors, composers, conductors, and teachers. 1883. The U.S. government outlaws the sun dance and other sacred ceremonies to force the assimilation of indigenous people into white Christian society. 1886. Perry S. Williams is born in Toledo, Ohio. As a teenager, he develops a passion for Native American folklore. He is particularly drawn to the Dakota legend of Winona, in which a young maiden, rather than give in to an unwanted suitor, throws herself into Lake Pepin, near what is now Lake City, Minnesota. At some point, Williams moves to Minneapolis. 1892. Famed Czech composer Antonin Dvorak arrives in New York City. In a now famous speech, he implores American composers to turn away from European musical influences and instead find indigenous sources of inspiration. 1899. Arthur Farwell returns to the U.S. and discovers an explosion of interest in Native American music. As the federal government continues its efforts to break down Native communities and assimilate them into white society, white anthropologists swoop in to document Native cultural activities before they disappear. Answering Dvorak's challenge, and armed with a strong dose of romanticism, a small cadre of American composers are merging Native melodies with classical forms. Farwell is enthralled, and goes on to become the most important composer of this Indianist movement. The following year, he founds Wawan Press as a music publishing company for American composers, including many Indianists. 1902. Artist and former Winona, Minnesota resident Isabel Moore Kimball completes work on this statue, Princess Winona, which is given pride of place in the town's Central Park. Kimball uses Native actress Beulah Tahamont as her model for Princess Winona. 1905. Frances Densmore makes her amateur anthropology debut when she and her sister Margaret trek to Grand Portage, Minnesota to document Ojibwe songs and dances. 2 years later, at age 40, Densmore begins a 50-year career with the Smithsonian's Bureau of American Ethnology, in which she documents thousands of songs and dances from Native communities around the country. 1909. Friend of Farwell, Charles Wakefield Cadman, composes From the Land of the Sky Blue Water, based on a song of the Omaha people. Sky Blue Water is, of course, a possible translation of the Dakota word Minnesota. 1911. Frances Densmore spends the summer interviewing Dakota elders, grilling them about their outlawed Sundance ceremony. Some eventually share their highly sacred songs, despite the fact that outsiders are forbidden from witnessing Sundance rituals. They even take her to the Sundance ceremony site. That same year, Alberto Bimboni emigrates to the United States and is immediately swept up in the Native American music craze. Around the same time, the now Minneapolis-based Perry S. Williams sets the legend of Winona into a poem. A few years later, he turns the poem into a libretto. Bimboni hears about it almost right away through a mutual friend. 1915. Bimboni begins work on Winona, an opera based on Williams' libretto. He confesses his obsession with getting the native melodies just right, melodies drawn directly from field studies by Francis Densmore. Bimboni employs at least 3 Lakota dance songs that Densmore had transcribed from the outlawed Sundance ceremony. 1916. Bimboni's obsession with Winona culminates when his wife gives birth to their daughter, Winona Bimboni. Of course. 1917. Bimboni publishes Songs of the American Indians, featuring 4 songs derived from Dakota and Ojibwe sources, with lyrics by Minnesotans Francis Densmore and Perry S. Williams. 1918. Bimboni finally completes work on Winona, but has nowhere to publish or perform it. Farwell's Wawan Press had folded just 6 years earlier. That same year, Farwell moves to California, where his other great lifelong passion, community singing, inspires the eventual construction of a new public music venue, the now legendary Hollywood Bowl, recently ranked one of the top 10 venues in the country by Rolling Stone magazine. 1921. The first play put on at the Hollywood Bowl is Landing of the Pilgrim Fathers, directed by native actress Beulah Tahamont, whose bronze likeness still looks out over Winona, Minnesota to this day. 1923. Sitting U.S. President Warren G. Harding personally intervenes to help get Winona performed live. Harding twice writes letters to the Metropolitan Opera on Bimboni's behalf. The Met bravely turns the president down both times. Harding dies suddenly of a heart attack shortly thereafter. 1926. Winona is finally performed live in Portland, Oregon. January 27, 1928. Winona receives its second public performance, this time in Minneapolis, Minnesota. In the months leading up to the event, a special opera committee is led by high society families Lowry, Pillsbury, and McKnight. Playing the part of the story's villain is Chief Capolican, a Chilean-born member of the Araucanian tribe, and the first indigenous person to perform starring roles at the Metropolitan Opera. His involvement is played up in the press as evidence of the show's native authenticity. Winona's enormous 100-plus cast includes 6 Ojibwe performers, also leveraged in the press. The night of the dress rehearsal, Williams and Bimboni are adopted into the Mississippi River Band of Chippewa Indians in a simple ceremony led by Ojibwe performers Chief J.P. Buffalo and Joseph Bellegarde. When asked about the opera, Bellegarde says, "It almost makes me cry to hear it." Ultimately, more than 9,000 people attend the opera's single performance, including 2,000 out-of-towners drawn by the trainload thanks to special railroad rates for the occasion. The massive event fills the brand-new Minneapolis Auditorium, home of the Minneapolis Lakers, nearly to its 10,000-seat capacity. Newspapers call Winona Minnesota's own Grand Opera. Williams describes the opera as indigenous to the state of Minnesota. Reviews of the production hail it a colossal success. Winona even makes it into Time magazine. Bimboni is given the David Bispham Memorial Medal Award at the performance by the head of the American Opera Society. Princess Winona Bimboni herself even makes an appearance. Minnesota's own Grand Opera and its creators are the talk of the town. Briefly. And yet, this glorious moment marks the last gasp of the Indianist movement. The Jazz Age is in full swing, and Romanticism is dead. Winona is never staged publicly again, and remains unpublished to this day. 1933. Ojibwe singer and Winona cast member Joseph Bellegarde performs at the inauguration of President Franklin D. Roosevelt. 1934. The federal government finally lifts its 50-year prohibition on the sacred Sundance ceremony, 6 years after Densmore and Bimboni put its songs on stage for nearly 10,000 white Minnesotans to see. 1952. Arthur Farwell dies, his work largely unknown outside of classical music enthusiasts and academics. Later that same year, Red Lake Ojibwe artist Patrick Desjarlais creates The Hams Bear for Minneapolis advertising agency Campbell Mithun, which pairs it with a highly reworked version of From the Land of the Sky Blue Water to become an iconic Minnesota brand campaign still known and loved today. White America wanted Native culture as a historical artifact to admire and repurpose, not as a living, breathing, human reality in the present tense. And the result of that is a story so problematic, it's been all but forgotten. So, can Minnesota claim a central role in this story? QED. regrettably. But there's no tidy conclusion here, just an utterly human mess of bold innovation, unspeakable trauma, and unclear intentions, mashed together into a confusing intercultural blend, which is frankly rather Minnesotan, don't you think? So, to put a more appropriate punctuation at the end of this story, here's Red Lake Ojibwe artist Robert Desjarlais's re-imaging of his father Patrick's creation, lovingly adorned in Ojibwe regalia. Now that's the bare refreshing.